Alright, I'm now about to plastigage the first main bearing, the one on the front. As you can see, I've cut a piece of plastigage about the width of the bearing there. Needs to be a little shorter actually, doesn't want to go off the end, but it don't hurt nothing on the first bearing anyway. So now about to put the main cap on. I've got the main cap clean. By the way, I like to clean my parts right before I use them, clean them and dry them off, so I know that they're absolutely clean. So I just washed this part and dried it off, wiped it down. Same with the bolts, and I cleaned it in my parts cleaning sink. It's about the cleanest thing I've ever seen. Got shocked by that, but anyway. So I just cleaned this main bearing cap. I'm now about to put the shells, the other shell in the main caps. And if you notice, the caps came in boxes. So this is the shell for the back bearing. I'm not doing that yet, but so the last one, I put that one on first. Then I did this one, which was the third bearing from the front, second bearing from the front, and the front bearing. So as I do this, going back, I'm gonna put the same shell that I took off on the two halves together. Don't know if you have to do that. I'm just kind of, manufacturers tend to make things in pairs that have to match up, so that's how I'm gonna do it. So this first shell is gonna go in this first main cap, and then I'm gonna torque it down and check the plastigage or check clearance. Now, one thing I want you to notice is you see that there's a number 1 stamped into this cap. My other caps have the numbers 2. There's the 2 right there, and 3 stamped in. Obviously, you don't have to worry about 4 because it's odd and just unique to that spot. But the other 3 are the same, so you have to mark them because they're matched to the block. So once again, you want to match things up and put them back where they were. Not all blocks have the caps stamped like this. Obviously, it's been rebuilt before. Matter of fact, it's been rebuilt by Eagle Boat or Eagle Engines, because that's where my brother bought this engine from. There's the date. It was rebuilt 2014, December 12, 2014. There's the part number or whatever. But anyway, as I was saying, when you disassemble a motor, you need to take a hammer and a punch. And what I do is I punch the first cap with a single dot, anywhere on here's fine. Just hit it with one single dot to represent 1. Then I punch 2 with 2 dots, and I leave 3 with no dots because 3 is the only one left, and then 4 is unique. So I punch 1 and I punch 2, and I leave 3 alone. That's the fewest number of dots. So that's how I mark mine. So if you don't want to punch them, you could mark them with some wire tags or wire and some tags, but to me it's easier to punch them. You can't really, if you want to mark them with a put a mark on them with a Sharpie, you'd have to clean them, and that's kind of a pain. You're in the process of tearing the motor down, and you don't want to stop and clean parts, clean oil off of it, so I don't really like using Sharpie for that, but I have done that before. But like I say, just make sure you punch them before you disassemble them, because once you take them apart and get them mixed up, you're not going to be able to get it back the way you had it, unless you luck up. So once again, I'm about to put the bearing shell in the cap, put it on there, torque it down, and read the plastigage. So the next step, I'll show you the plastigage and how it's read. So in this video, I'm about to put the first main bearing cap on, and I want to point out 2 things first. One, the little tab on the bearing goes on the same side as the tab on the crank. So that would be this side right here. There's the tab right down there, and that tab, so they go together. Also, if you don't pay attention to that, there's another way you can tell. There's an arrow on the top of the main bearing cap. Arrow's right there. That arrow should point to the front. You can see that, so that arrow points to the front. This is the number 1. Somebody stamped this with the number 1, but this is the number 1 main cap. Arrow points to the front. So I'm now about to put it on the engine. And by the way, I've got the piece of plastigage already on here, so I'm going to push this down in here, and we'll put the bolts in and then torque this thing down. And you got to be very careful how you torque it down. By the way, you can put a little bit of oil on the threads. I'm going to put some oil on these threads before I put it in. So I'm going to do this, torque these bolts down, and then undo it and check the plastigage. That'll be the next step. So I'm going to stop the video here, and next video will show the plastic gauge and how I check the clearance. Also, I'll tell you what the torque value is when I torque these down when I look it up, after I look it up. Alright, I've now used plastic gauge on the #1 main bearing cap, and you can see there's the plastic gauge there. Let me see if I can get it to focus. There you go. So you can see how the wax string got compressed when I tightened down the bearing. So now if I take this sheet, I'm sorry my hands are shaking here. If I take the sheet and try to match it up, it's hard to do with one hand, but the closest it comes to is the 0.002 inch clearance. So I know this is not a good video showing you that, but if you put this thing down there very close to that smashed piece of plastic string or wax string, the closest one that matches is 0.002. So my clearance on this bearing is 0.002, probably plus or minus 5/10 thousandths, but that's accurate enough. So that's what I need to know. So this is 0.002, which is pretty good. I'm gonna look up the specs in a minute and find out if that's the right number, but I'm pretty sure it is. So also while I was doing this, I looked up the torque. The torque for the main bearing cap bolts is 77 foot-pounds. So that's what I'm gonna torque all these down to. So I've done #1. Oh, by the way, after you do the plastic gauge and measure it, you write it down, and then you scrape this plastic gauge off you scrape it off the bearing, you scrape it off the journal here. You also scrape it off the bearing. It leaves a residue on both. So there's the bearing. So I'm going to scrape it off that and the journal. So that's how you plastic gauge. I'm going to go ahead and do the other 3 main bearings, and then I'll do them all together and compare my measurements on both methods and see what make sure the crank's straight. So I'll show you another video when I get to that, when I get them all done. Alright, I've now finished plastic gauging all 4 bearings, and all of them were 0.002 clearance, so that's within spec. The max clearance on this first bearing is 0.002, so it's under that. And the max clearance on the last 3 is 0.0025. It's a 5/10 thousandths more than the first one, but they're all within spec, 0.002. So what I'm now going to do is oil these bearing halves in the block, put oil, smear oil all over the block, all over the bearings, set the crankshaft back in, and then put oil on the main cap bearings, and then torque the main cap bearings down to 77 foot-pounds, and the crank will be installed. And then after that, I'm going to install the rear main seal. I'm not sure what the piece is called, but it's a rear main seal retainer with the rear main seal on the back. Alright, I now have all the main bearing caps installed. I've got them partially torqued down by hand, but I haven't torqued them down with a torque wrench yet. I'm about to do that. One thing I wanted to point out was when the main cap right here sits at the thrust bearing, you're supposed to leave it, get it finger tight, and then tap the back of the crankshaft, and then tap the front of the crankshaft, and that will line up the thrust bearings top and bottom, so that before you torque them down. So that's what I'm about to do, and then I'll torque all these. There's 8 bolts. I'll torque them down to 77 foot-pounds, and the crankshaft to be installed. Just wanted to make sure you knew about the thrust bearing, seating of the thrust bearings. Okay, I'm now at the stage where the crank's installed. All the bolts are torqued down to 77 foot-pounds in 2 stages. I go to about 50 and then finish up at 77. And then I've installed the rear main bearing. It's kind of hard to see in the dark, but I've installed the rear main bearing seal device here. The seal's pressed into this metal part, and then you slide it on and just screw the bolts down. I use on the gasket, I use this material right here. It's called Permatex Aviation Forming Gasket. It's very sticky stuff, and it resists oil and gasoline very well. So that's what I use on all my gaskets to seal them. Well, at least paper gaskets anyway. I don't put on rubber gaskets. So anyway, rear main seal's installed. Crankshaft's turning freely with my hand. So you can see the crankshaft's turning. There's a little bit of resistance from the rear seal, but it's turning pretty good. All of right now we got, I've just got engine oil on all the bearings to lubricate it. And I'm going to prime the engine by spinning the oil pump with an electric drill before I crank it up anyway, so it'll be primed and get more oil to the bearings before I crank it up. So at this stage, I'm fixing to flip the engine over upright and put the camshaft, balance shaft, the camshaft, and timing chain on and get all that done. So I'll do a video when I get to that part.